The evening was quiet, almost too quiet. The sun had just begun to dip behind the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. On the empty streets, cars moved slowly, the occasional hum of an engine breaking the calm. She had been driving home from a long day at work, her mind occupied with the small, ordinary thoughts of daily life, the grocery list she still needed to complete, the dishes waiting in her sink, the sound of her favorite playlist ready to greet her at home. It had been a routine shift, nothing out of the ordinary, and she was glad to finally be heading home. Her car was her sanctuary, a place where she could relax, listen to music, and think. She kept her eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, and tried to shake off the stress of the day. She wasn't in a rush. There was no reason to hurry. But that peace, as delicate as it was, didn't last long. A set of flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought it might be a traffic accident ahead or maybe someone pulled over. But then a sudden pang of anxiety hit her. The lights were behind her, moving slowly, signaling her to stop. She glanced around. There was barely any traffic, no other cars nearby, just her and the officer signaling her. Her heart began to beat faster. She complied immediately, pulling her car to the side of the road, parking it carefully as she took a deep breath to calm herself. The officer approached cautiously, his hands visible, a standard approach she had seen countless times in movies and on the news. She rolled down her window and greeted him politely. "Good evening, officer," she said, her voice calm but steady. "Is there a problem?" He looked at her license and registration, his expression unreadable. "We pulled you over for a routine stop," he said. The words were simple, ordinary, but somehow the tone carried a weight that made her tense. She handed over her documents, trying not to let her nervousness show. Everything should have been simple. A routine stop meant questions, a ticket maybe, and then she would be on her way. But there was something in the officer's posture, the way he shifted from foot to foot, that made her uneasy. It wasn't just the stop itself, it was the atmosphere, the tension hanging in the air like a heavy fog. She had learned over the years that sometimes ordinary situations could spiral quickly. Her mind raced as she tried to predict what could happen next, but she kept her movements slow and deliberate, showing she meant no harm. Another officer approached from the other side of her car. The sound of his boots against the asphalt was unnerving, echoing in the quiet street. He leaned slightly, his eyes scanning her carefully, and she noticed how both men's hands were close to their belts near their holsters. Her stomach tightened. She was trained to assess threats quickly, to notice subtle movements that might indicate danger. She knew this wasn't the right moment to panic, but her instincts told her to be alert. "Ma'am, do you know why we stopped you?" the first officer asked again, his voice firm but not aggressive. "I'm not sure, officer. Was I speeding?" she replied, keeping her tone steady. The officer glanced at her documents, then back at her. "Just a routine check," he said. "We're making sure everything's in order." She nodded slowly. "Of course," she said, her hands resting on her lap where he could see them. Her mind was racing, thinking about what to do next, how to keep this interaction calm. She knew that one wrong move could escalate things unnecessarily. A sudden sound broke the quiet, a small misstep, maybe a brush of metal against metal, and one of the officers flinched. It was a split second, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the tension spike. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She kept her breathing controlled, steady, reminding herself to stay calm, to keep the situation from spiraling out of control. The officer asked her to step out of the car. She hesitated for a moment, glancing at the other officer who was watching carefully. Her hands went up slightly, showing compliance. She stepped out slowly, keeping her movements deliberate. Every muscle in her body was alert, ready for anything, yet she maintained a calm exterior. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer instructed. She obeyed immediately. Her training had taught her the importance of control, not just physical but emotional. Panic could make a situation worse. She focused on her breathing, on keeping a clear mind. As she stood there, she couldn't help but notice how the officers seemed on edge, their eyes flicking to her car, then back at her. Something about the way they moved suggested that they were expecting trouble, and that expectation made the air heavier, thicker. She realized that sometimes fear itself could cause mistakes, and she knew that a calm, steady demeanor was her best defense. The first officer reached for his radio, speaking in a low voice. She didn't know what he said, but she felt the shift immediately. The tension grew, She could sense that the situation might escalate if she didn't stay careful. She shifted slightly, her weight balanced, ready to react if necessary. Her mind went through every scenario, every possible move. She wasn't thinking of violence but of survival, of keeping control until the officers realized she was not a threat. Then, it happened. A sudden motion. One of the officers flinched again, perhaps misunderstanding something she did, or maybe reacting to his own nerves. A gunshot rang out, sharp and loud, breaking the evening's calm. She dropped instinctively to the ground, her body moving faster than her thoughts. Training from years ago, skills honed in disciplined environments kicked in without hesitation. She found cover behind the side of her car, her mind racing but her movements precise. Adrenaline surged, sharpening her senses. Every sound, every movement around her was amplified. She could hear the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a car engine, the sharp commands being shouted. Her body was tense, but her mind was clear. She was not panicking. She knew exactly what she needed to do to stay safe. From her position behind the car, she could see the officers. Confusion written across their faces. They had expected compliance, fear, maybe even resistance, but nothing like this. She wasn't scared in the way they assumed she would be. She was calculated, aware, ready to protect herself until the situation could be controlled. The officers realized, perhaps too late, that they had misjudged her. She wasn't just an ordinary civilian. She was someone who knew how to react in high-pressure situations, someone whose calm could be mistaken for confidence but was rooted in training and experience. As the seconds stretched on, the tension hung thick in the air. Passers-by, if any were present, would have been frozen in place, unsure of what to do. The ordinary street had turned into a scene of high stakes, a moment that could have ended in tragedy but hadn't. Yet, she stayed low, her mind focused on the one goal she had: survive the moment without causing unnecessary harm. Every step, every breath, every decision was deliberate. She reminded herself constantly that panic was the enemy. Calm, control, and awareness were her allies. Minutes felt like hours. The officers' shouts grew more urgent, their movements more cautious. She could sense the shift, the realization that she wasn't just another person pulled over. Her identity, her experience, her training, it all gave her an advantage they hadn't anticipated. The first part of the encounter ended not with violence, but with a tense stalemate. She was safe for the moment, but she knew that this was only the beginning. The night was far from over, and the ordinary drive home had turned into something extraordinary. Every fiber of her being was alert, every thought focused. She had learned long ago that situations could change in a heartbeat. One moment, everything was routine. The next, life itself could hang in the balance. She reminded herself to stay calm, to stay aware, and to trust her instincts. And in that quiet, tense moment, she realized something important. She was not powerless. She had the skills, the knowledge, and the composure to navigate this unexpected danger. All she had to do was stay in control until help arrived, until the situation could be resolved without needless harm. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The evening sky, once calm and peaceful, now seemed heavy, the fading light casting long shadows across the street. But she was not afraid. She was ready. This was just the beginning of a night that would test her in ways she had never imagined, a night that would show her strength, skill, and courage, and she knew deep down that she would face it head-on, without hesitation, without fear, and with the full awareness of what was at stake. The night had grown darker, the soft colors of sunset replaced by the deep black of early evening. Streetlights flickered on, casting pools of yellow light across the asphalt. The tension on that quiet road had not diminished. Every sound, every movement was amplified. Her heart still raced, but it was no longer from panic. It was a focused awareness, a sharp attention to the unfolding situation. She stayed low behind her car, muscles ready to react, eyes scanning every detail. She had trained for pressure situations before, but nothing in her life had ever felt quite like this. The officers were cautious now, their hands near their belts, their voices raised slightly. Though there was uncertainty underlying every command, it was clear they hadn't expected her response, the calm, measured reaction that defied their assumptions. She could see the frustration in their eyes, the way their bodies stiffened with each movement. She understood exactly how that felt. They were trapped by their own fear and training, and she had to keep that advantage without escalating things unnecessarily. She took a careful breath, steadying herself, She needed to assess the situation, decide the safest course of action, and protect herself. Her eyes swept the area. There were no civilians nearby, no other cars, just the empty road stretching behind and ahead of her. The only noise was the occasional distant hum of traffic, the shuffle of boots against the pavement, and the soft whine of her own pulse in her ears. The first officer spoke again, his tone sharper this time. "Step away from the car now." She didn't move quickly. She didn't make sudden gestures. Instead, she stayed low, careful, measuring every motion. "I'm not going to hurt anyone," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I just want to stay safe." There was a pause, a brief hesitation. She could sense it, a split second where the officers were unsure how to proceed. That hesitation gave her space, breathing room, and she used it to her advantage. She subtly adjusted her stance, keeping herself shielded while also signaling that she was aware and in control. Then it happened. A movement she hadn't expected. One officer, perhaps thinking he had the upper hand, moved closer. His hand shifted slightly toward his holster, his posture tense. It was instinct, an automatic reaction to the stress of the moment. She could see the decision forming in his eyes, the uncertainty, the fear. She knew that a split second could make the difference between life and death. Her training took over completely. Years of careful preparation, of drills and discipline, allowed her to respond without hesitation. She ducked slightly, keeping herself low and prepared to react defensively. Every sense was heightened. She could hear the faintest shift in weight, see the smallest flicker of movement. She wasn't reckless, but she was ready. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," she said. Her voice was steady, confident. She didn't raise it, didn't shout. She wanted to communicate control, to show that she was calm but also capable. The officers froze for a moment, unsure. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected someone to maintain such composure in a situation that most people would have panicked in. Her eyes flicked to the officer closest to her. He seemed tense, uncertain. She didn't want to hurt him, didn't want to escalate unnecessarily, but she knew she had to protect herself. One wrong move from either side could turn the situation into something far more dangerous. Time seemed to stretch, each second heavy with tension. Her mind raced, planning her next move while her body stayed calm, controlled. She thought about every possible angle, every escape route, every way to de-escalate without harm. But she also knew that if the officers acted recklessly, she would have to defend herself. The air was thick with anticipation. Even the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze sounded louder than it should. She could see the flash of adrenaline on the officers' faces, the way their bodies reacted before their minds even caught up, and she knew that this moment could change everything. Suddenly, one officer made a motion that could have been harmless. But it wasn't. In a fraction of a second, the other officer interpreted it as a threat. A shot rang out. The loud crack of gunfire shattered the silence of the night, echoing down the empty street. She dropped lower, her body instinctively moving to cover. Her training had prepared her for this. She assessed the situation instantly, identifying threats, calculating risk, and planning her response. Her hands moved with precision, steady and deliberate. She wasn't thinking about anger or revenge, she was thinking about survival, about controlling a situation that had spun far beyond routine. The officer who had fired was frozen for a moment, perhaps surprised at her calm response. She could see the tension, the confusion, and the recognition that they had underestimated her. She was no ordinary civilian. They had expected fear, panic, compliance. They had expected someone who could be controlled, intimidated, or overpowered. They hadn't expected her calm, calculated reaction. She took a slow, deliberate breath. Her mind ran through options, focusing on the safest possible outcome. She needed to protect herself without unnecessary harm, to show she was in control without escalating beyond what was necessary. The officers were tense, unsure, and that hesitation gave her space to act intelligently. From her position, she could see the street clearly. There were no bystanders close enough to be in danger, no other cars to complicate the scene. She had cover, visibility, and awareness, all of which gave her an advantage. She kept her movements controlled, her focus sharp, her mind calm. "Please stay calm," she said, her voice low but firm. "Nobody needs to get hurt." Her words seemed to have an effect. The officers hesitated, shifting slightly, unsure. She could see that they were trying to reassess, to understand the situation, to find a way to resolve it without further escalation. She maintained her composure, letting them know silently that she was capable, aware, and not a threat unless provoked. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Every sound was amplified: the shuffle of feet, the rustle of clothing, the distant hum of traffic. Her body remained tense but controlled, her mind analyzing, planning, and staying one step ahead. She knew that any rash move from either side could turn the moment deadly. She adjusted her stance slightly, maintaining a low profile behind the car. Her eyes scanned constantly, noting the positions of the officers, the potential escape routes, and the layout of the street. She was aware of every detail: the shadows, the reflections in nearby windows, the flicker of light from the police vehicles. Every observation was a piece of the puzzle, helping her navigate the danger with precision. The first officer called out again, his voice sharper this time. "Step away from the vehicle." She didn't move quickly. Instead, she stayed calm, deliberate. "I'm trying to stay safe," she said. "I'm not going to make this worse." There was a pause. The tension was almost unbearable. Then a small shift, an acknowledgement from the officers that they had misjudged her. They began to adjust, moving slightly, trying to reassess without provoking further danger. She could sense the change, the realization that she was no ordinary person. That awareness gave her even more control, even more space to protect herself and navigate the moment safely. Her body remained ready, but her mind was clear. She didn't panic. She didn't make rash decisions. Instead, she focused on observation, communication, and survival. She understood fully that composure could save lives, not just hers, but others who might have been affected by a careless action. The officers seemed to realize the situation was more complicated than they expected. Their movements became more cautious, their commands slower, more deliberate. She could see the tension slowly give way to careful calculation, a recognition that the moment required calm, not force. She stayed low, breathing evenly, keeping her hands visible, her posture controlled. Every instinct, every training, every experience she had ever had was guiding her through this tense night. She was aware of danger, but she was not afraid. Fear could have made her reckless, but control gave her power. The night stretched on. The situation was unresolved, but for the first time since it began, there was a shift, an opening, a moment of possibility. She could see that the officers were reconsidering their actions, questioning their assumptions, and that gave her hope. Hope that the situation could end without further shots, without unnecessary harm. She remained behind her car, a silent, calm presence amid the chaos. Her mind continued to calculate, assess, and plan. She wasn't looking for conflict. She was looking for safety, but she was ready to respond, to act decisively if necessary. And in that tense, fragile night, she understood something crucial. Control, awareness, and calm were her greatest tools. They were what kept her safe, what allowed her to navigate a situation that could have ended in disaster. She wasn't just surviving, she was leading herself through danger with intelligence and precision, showing strength in a moment that demanded courage. The street remained quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional shuffle of boots. But she felt the subtle shift in energy, the realization that she was not a passive participant, that she was in command of her own safety. And with that knowledge, she prepared for the next phase, knowing the night was far from over. She would not panic. She would not make rash decisions. She would stay calm, stay aware, and navigate the danger with skill and precision. And so the night continued. A tense, measured standoff that tested every skill, every instinct, and every ounce of her calm. She was ready for whatever came next. The street was silent now, but the quiet was heavy, thick with tension. Every second felt drawn out, stretching into an eternity where the wrong move could change everything. She remained behind the car, low and steady, her breathing controlled, her mind analyzing every movement, every shift of weight, every sound. She could feel the officers' attention focused entirely on her, their uncertainty growing with every passing moment. They hadn't expected her to remain calm, and that calm gave her a quiet power, a space to assess the situation carefully. From her position, she watched them closely. Their posture was tense, their hands hovering near their holsters. Their eyes flicked from her to the car, then back at her again. They were expecting her to panic, to make a sudden move that would justify force. But she was not that person. She had trained for moments like this, had prepared herself for situations where fear could take over. And now every lesson, every practice, every instinct came together in perfect timing. She knew she needed to maintain control, to prevent unnecessary harm while still protecting herself. Every fiber of her body was alert, ready to act if the situation escalated. Her eyes scanned the area for any potential threats, any civilians nearby, and for escape routes if they became necessary. She found no immediate danger except the officers themselves, and she knew that their actions would determine how the night unfolded. Then, almost imperceptibly, one of the officers made a movement. It was slight, a shift of weight, but enough for her trained eyes to notice. She didn't jump. She didn't flinch. Instead, she reacted with precision. She adjusted her position behind the car, ensuring she remained covered while keeping a clear line of sight. Every muscle was tense but controlled. She wasn't afraid. She was aware a command rang out. "Step away from the car now." She stayed low, her voice calm and deliberate. "I'm not going to hurt anyone. Please just stay calm." The officer hesitated. That pause, brief as it was, gave her a moment of advantage. She could see their uncertainty, the internal struggle between fear, training, and the reality of the situation. And in that moment, she realized that the officers had underestimated her completely. They had expected panic, confusion, maybe defiance, but they had not expected focus, composure, or awareness. Suddenly, another shot rang out, louder this time. The sound cracked through the night, startling and sharp. She felt the vibration in the ground beneath her feet. Instinctively, she dropped lower, using the car as cover, assessing the trajectory and source of the fire. Her heart did not race. It stayed steady, controlled. Panic was useless. Focus was necessary. From behind the car, she could see the officer who had fired the second shot. His eyes were wide, his movements jittery, a clear sign that he had overreacted to the situation. She recognized the fear in his body, the uncertainty in his posture. She knew that if she did not act carefully, this could spiral into something much worse. Her mind went through options quickly. She needed to protect herself, yes, but she also needed to avoid unnecessary harm. Every movement had to be deliberate, every decision precise. She wasn't looking to escalate the situation. She was looking to control it, to navigate it, and to survive. Then she made a calculated move. With careful precision, she adjusted her stance, preparing for the worst while still signaling calm. Her hands remained visible for the officers to see, but she was ready to defend herself if another shot came. She knew she had to act decisively if the situation continued to escalate, and she trusted her training to guide her actions. The officers seemed to realize that they had misjudged her. Their movements became more cautious, slower, more measured. She could see the uncertainty growing in their eyes. They were trying to find a way to regain control, but she was already in control of her own actions. Every decision, every breath, every shift of weight was calculated to protect herself and minimize risk. She took a deep, steadying breath. Her mind was clear, focused entirely on survival and strategy. She didn't move hastily. She didn't panic. Instead, she prepared herself mentally for the next steps, ready to respond if necessary, but hoping that her calm could influence the situation toward resolution rather than further escalation. Another command came from the officers, more forceful this time. "Show your hands, now!" She obeyed partially, raising her hands slowly while keeping her body low and protected. She spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not a threat. I just want this to end safely. Please stay calm." The officers froze, unsure how to proceed. They were caught between training and reality, between fear and the realization that she was not going to act recklessly. That uncertainty created a small window of opportunity, a chance for her to maintain control without escalating the danger further. She shifted slightly behind the car, ensuring she remained in cover while keeping a clear view of the officers. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture controlled. She wasn't looking to provoke or intimidate. She was looking to survive, to navigate the dangerous moment with awareness and precision. Suddenly, she noticed one of the officers was attempting to reposition, perhaps to get a clearer shot or assert dominance. She reacted instantly, adjusting her stance to maintain cover while preparing for defensive action. Her mind calculated angles, distances, and potential outcomes. She wasn't thinking about fear. She was thinking about survival. A third shot rang out. This time it was closer, more precise. She ducked instinctively, rolling slightly to maintain cover while keeping her eyes on the source. Her heart stayed steady, her focus unbroken. She could see the panic in the officer's eyes, the realization that their assumptions had been wrong. They hadn't expected her to respond with such composure, such awareness. Her training as a disciplined professional kicked in completely. She moved decisively, positioning herself to protect vital areas while preparing for defensive action. She wasn't aggressive. She was strategic. She knew that any further escalation could be dangerous, but she also knew that she had to protect herself if the officers acted recklessly again. The standoff continued, tense and uncertain. Each second stretched, every sound amplified. She could hear the officers breathing, the shuffle of their boots, the faint whisper of their radios. She could sense their hesitation, their struggle to assess her as something other than a threat, but also as someone capable, aware, and in control. Then, she made her move. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. She positioned herself carefully, ensuring her movements were precise and controlled. She aimed not to harm unnecessarily, but to neutralize the immediate danger. Every action was deliberate, calculated to maintain her safety while minimizing harm to others. The officers froze in shock. They hadn't expected her to act, hadn't anticipated the controlled response that now unfolded before them. She was calm, precise, and fully aware, a stark contrast to the panic and confusion that surrounded them. Her presence alone shifted the balance of power, a reminder that assumptions could be deadly, and that control was often the difference between life and death. Time seemed to stretch again. Each moment was heavy with potential consequences. She stayed low, protected and alert, ready to react if necessary, but hoping for a resolution that didn't involve further violence. Her mind remained sharp, analyzing every possible outcome, every movement from the officers, every shift in the environment around her. The officers finally seemed to pause, recognizing that they had underestimated her completely. Their movements slowed, their commands grew less forceful, and for the first time a cautious respect entered the situation. They were realizing that she was not a passive participant, not someone to be controlled through intimidation or fear. She was aware, prepared, and fully capable of protecting herself. She remained behind the car, calm and steady, her eyes scanning constantly, her mind alert. She didn't move hastily, didn't act recklessly. Every decision was measured, deliberate, and aimed at ensuring safety, for herself, for the officers, and for anyone else who might have been nearby. The street remained quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of boots and the distant hum of traffic. But the energy had shifted. The officers were no longer acting purely on fear. They were thinking, reassessing, realizing that control and composure mattered as much as training or firepower. She had created space, a moment of possibility where reason could take over. She breathed slowly, deliberately, letting her calm reinforce her awareness. She knew that the night was far from over, that danger could return at any moment, but she was ready. She had survived the initial escalation, maintained control, and kept her focus sharp. And she knew that her next actions would determine whether the situation could be resolved safely or spiral further into chaos. As she stayed low, she reflected briefly on how quickly life could change, how ordinary moments could transform into high-stakes situations in an instant. She had not been afraid, not in the way most people would have been. Fear could have made her reckless, made her a victim of circumstance. Instead, she had relied on calm, precision, and awareness to navigate the danger. The officers were still present, still tense, still unsure. But she had shifted the balance. She was no longer simply reacting. She was in command of her own safety, fully aware of the CID consequences, fully prepared to act if necessary. And in that heavy, tense night, she realized the truth of her own strength. It was not aggression that kept her safe, but composure, awareness, and the courage to act decisively when necessary. She had survived the first escalation, had maintained control, and was ready for whatever came next. The night had changed. What had started as a routine stop had become a test of skill, awareness, and calm under pressure. She had navigated the chaos with precision, and now the street held a fragile balance, one that depended entirely on her continued composure and careful decisions. She stayed low, her breathing even, her mind sharp, fully aware that the night was far from over, but confident that she had the ability to navigate it safely. The night had become tense in ways she could never have imagined when she first got into her car that evening. What should have been a simple, routine stop had turned into a test of patience, focus, and survival. The air was thick with expectation, and every sound, every shuffle of boots, every rustle of clothing felt amplified. She remained low behind her car, muscles tense but controlled, eyes constantly scanning, mind analyzing. Every second could change the outcome of the night, and she knew she had to stay sharp. From her position, she could see the officers clearly. Their movements had slowed. The adrenaline that had driven them moments ago was replaced by hesitation, a mixture of fear and realization. They were beginning to understand that she was not someone to be underestimated. That calm presence, that unwavering composure, had shifted the balance in her favor. But she also knew that the situation was far from resolved. She couldn't afford to relax. She had to maintain awareness, maintain control, and anticipate the next move. A distant sound caught her attention, the faint wail of sirens, growing closer. Backup was on its way. Relief washed over her, but it was tempered by caution. She knew that additional officers arriving could either help resolve the situation safely or create more confusion if the scene wasn't managed carefully. She stayed low, still protected behind the car, and continued to monitor every movement of the officers already present. As the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, the officers who had initially confronted her began speaking into their radios, giving rapid updates. Their voices were tense, their words clipped. She could sense their anxiety even without seeing their faces clearly. They were trying to regain a sense of control, to explain the situation to arriving units, but the realization of their misjudgment weighed on them. She thought about the people who might be arriving soon, the other officers, the emergency personnel, anyone who could witness what had happened. She understood that her actions would be scrutinized, that they would need to explain why a simple traffic stop had escalated into this standoff. She took a deep, steadying breath, focusing on clarity, control, and patience. Every movement, every decision, every word would matter in the moments to come. The backup units arrived slowly, their lights flashing, illuminating the dark street. They moved with caution, fully aware that the situation was tense. She could see them positioning themselves, assessing from a distance, communicating quietly through radios. The presence of additional officers brought a mix of relief and renewed alertness. Relief because there were now trained eyes watching the situation, and alertness because more people meant more unpredictability. She stayed low, remaining behind her car, her hands visible, her body calm but ready. Her mind analyzed the scene, the positions of the officers, the potential threats, and the safest ways to navigate the next moments. She didn't want confrontation. She wanted resolution, but she also knew that she could not afford to let her guard down. Control and awareness had kept her safe this far, and they would continue to do so. The officers closest to her spoke to the arriving backup, explaining the situation in hurried tones. She could hear fragments of words, the tension in their voices unmistakable. Routine stop, one said, though the words felt hollow. Shots fired. Woman behind the car. Armed. She didn't panic at the label of armed. She understood the perception, but she also knew that her composure had prevented unnecessary harm up to this point. The arriving officers began to assess her, scanning from a distance, positioning themselves strategically. She remained calm, keeping her hands where they could be seen, showing that she was not a threat to those who were approaching carefully. She understood that this was a critical moment, one where her behavior could influence the actions of others and the outcome of the night. Minutes passed slowly, each one heavy with tension. She could feel the officers' eyes on her, and she met them with steady, calm focus. She did not make sudden movements. She did not speak unless necessary. Her presence, her composure, and her awareness sent a silent message. She was aware, prepared, and fully capable of managing her own safety. The lead officer from the backup team approached slowly, signaling for her to remain calm. His gestures were deliberate, measured. She obeyed, staying low, keeping her hands visible. She could see the careful assessment in his eyes, the recognition that she was not an ordinary person to be rushed or threatened. She spoke softly, her voice calm and steady. "I don't want anyone to get hurt. I'm just trying to stay safe." The officer nodded slightly, acknowledging her words, and continued to assess the situation with the team. His body language communicated caution, but also a willingness to de-escalate. She realized that the moment had shifted. What had begun as a confrontation was now becoming a negotiation, a careful balance of communication, awareness, and strategy. She remained behind the car, scanning constantly, her mind calculating every angle, every possibility. She considered the approach of backup, the movement of the initial officers, and the environment around her. The empty street, the soft glow of street lights, and the flashing emergency lights all became part of her situational awareness. She had to maintain control not just for herself, but for anyone else who might enter the scene. The officers closest to her began to move slightly backward, giving her space. It was a small gesture, but it signaled a shift in the standoff. She could sense their caution and growing respect, an understanding that her composure and awareness had changed the dynamic. She stayed low, continuing to speak calmly, reinforcing that her goal was safety, not conflict. The backup officers began to establish a perimeter, slowly, carefully. She could hear instructions over radios, officers communicating clearly, calmly. She stayed alert, ready to respond if necessary, but hopeful that the situation could now be resolved without further escalation. She thought about how quickly ordinary life could change. One moment she had been driving home after work, listening to music, thinking about dinner and chores. The next she was in a life-or-death standoff, fully aware that a single wrong move could have catastrophic consequences. She realized the importance of calm, focus, and control in moments like these, and how those qualities could shape the outcome more than force or fear ever could. The lead officer approached a little closer, keeping a safe distance. His gestures were measured. "We just want to make sure everyone stays safe," he said calmly. She nodded slightly, understanding that communication and composure were her allies. She spoke softly, maintaining eye contact where possible. "I want that too. I don't want anyone hurt. I'm just trying to stay safe." There was a pause, a moment of silent calculation on both sides. She could sense the tension in the air beginning to ease, replaced by cautious awareness. The officers were realizing that she was not an ordinary threat, that her training, composure, and awareness made her capable of managing her own safety effectively. Slowly, the officers closest to her moved back further, giving her more space. The backup team began to take control of the perimeter, communicating quietly and clearly. The street, once dominated by tension and fear, began to feel a little safer. She stayed low, maintaining her composure, her hands visible, her body alert but controlled. She could feel the weight of the night pressing down. The realization that what had begun as a simple stop had become a situation that tested every skill, every instinct, every ounce of composure she had. She stayed focused, knowing that patience, awareness, and calm had kept her safe so far, and they would continue to do so. The officers finally began speaking more clearly, giving instructions and coordinating movements. She complied fully, remaining low and visible, demonstrating that she was cooperative, aware, and committed to safety. The tension slowly began to dissipate as the officers adjusted their strategy, focusing on careful management rather than fear-driven reactions. She reflected briefly on the moments that had passed, the adrenaline, the fear, the precision required to navigate the danger. She realized that control, composure, and situational awareness were the true tools that had kept her safe, more than anything else. And now, as backup assumed responsibility for the scene, she could feel a cautious relief. The night was far from ordinary, but it was beginning to stabilize. The officers spoke among themselves, reassessing the site. Evaluation, sharing information, and planning the next steps. She remained behind the car, her posture calm, her hands visible, her mind clear and alert. She knew that the resolution depended on careful communication, awareness, and patience. She had maintained her control, and now it was up to the officers to respond appropriately. Minutes passed, slow and deliberate. She could hear the quiet exchange of words, the movement of boots, and the careful coordination of the backup team. She remained calm, breathing steadily, aware of every detail. The situation had shifted, but she knew that continued composure was essential. Finally, one of the lead officers spoke clearly, his voice calm but firm. "Let's bring this to a safe conclusion. No one needs to get hurt." She nodded slightly, keeping her position behind the car, her hands visible. Her presence, calm and controlled, reinforced that message. She wasn't a threat, and she didn't want harm to come to anyone. The night, which had begun as an ordinary drive home, had transformed into a tense, complex situation that tested every skill, every instinct and every ounce of her composure. And now, with the backup officers taking control and careful communication in place, she could feel the situation beginning to resolve. She stayed low for a few more minutes, ensuring that her actions were deliberate and controlled, demonstrating that she was aware, cooperative, and committed to safety. Slowly, carefully, the officers began to relax, moving with more confidence and purpose. The immediate danger had passed, replaced by the cautious process of resolution. In that quiet moment, she realized the true lesson of the night. Control, awareness, and composure could prevent disaster, even in the most unexpected situations. She had maintained her safety, protected others, and navigated a situation that could have ended tragically. And now, as the night slowly settled, she felt a deep sense of resilience and calm, knowing that she had faced the challenge with skill, awareness, and courage. The courtroom was quiet, almost too quiet except for the shuffle of papers and the occasional cough. She sat in the back row, her hands tightly clasped together, trying to calm her racing heart. It had been weeks since that terrifying night, but every detail still played in her mind like a relentless loop. The sounds of sirens, the flashes of light, the sudden terror when bullets flew, the instinct that had kicked in to survive. She remembered it all, and now, sitting here, she felt the weight of all those moments press down on her. The judge called the room to order, and the trial began. Her lawyer spoke clearly, laying out the events as they had happened. He told the story of a routine traffic stop that had turned into a nightmare, how she had been forced to defend herself, and how her actions had been a desperate response to immediate danger. He described her as a law-abiding citizen, someone who never sought confrontation but had the courage and quick thinking to survive when her life was threatened. Witnesses were called to testify. The neighbors who had seen the incident from their windows spoke carefully, their voices shaking at times. They described hearing the initial commands from the police, the sudden gunfire, and the panic that had swept through the street. Some had even recorded the events on their phones, the shaky videos now evidence in the case. Each testimony painted a picture of chaos, confusion, and fear, confirming that she had acted out of necessity and not malice. Her heart pounded as one of the officers involved took the stand. He spoke with a mix of hesitation and authority, recounting his version of the events. She listened silently, not reacting, though anger and fear bubbled beneath the surface. She tried to remember that she was here not to fight him again, but to let the truth of that night speak for itself. The officer's testimony was tense and defensive, but the evidence, the videos, and the other witnesses contradicted his claims, showing a much clearer picture of the danger she had faced. As the trial continued, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Every question, every answer seemed to hang in the air, heavy and important. She thought about her life before that night, the quiet mornings, the simple routines, the work that kept her busy and her mind focused. Now her life had been upended in an instant, and she had to fight not just for her freedom, but for her right to exist without fear. When it was her turn to speak, she stood carefully, feeling the weight of the room's attention. She explained in simple, honest words what she remembered. She spoke about the fear that had surged through her body, the instinct to survive the moment she realized she had no choice but to act. Her voice trembled at times, but she spoke with clarity, each word a piece of her truth. She wanted the people in that courtroom to understand not just the events, but the humanity behind them, the fear, and the instinct that had driven her actions. Outside the courtroom, the story had already spread. News outlets had covered the incident, some sensationally, others with care and accuracy. Social media buzzed with discussions, debates, and opinions. Many people were outraged, defending her right to protect herself. Others questioned the circumstances, the training of the police, and the broader implications for safety and justice. She paid little attention to the noise, focusing instead on the facts, the truth, and the support of the people who stood with her. Her lawyer worked tirelessly, cross-examining witnesses, presenting evidence, and challenging every assumption that could paint her in the wrong light. They showed her quick thinking had saved her life without unnecessary harm to others. They demonstrated that the officers had acted aggressively and without clear provocation. Piece by piece, the narrative that had threatened to criminalize her courage unraveled in the courtroom. Days passed, each one a mix of tension, exhaustion, and anticipation. She walked carefully between the courthouse and her temporary safe space, aware of the cameras and onlookers, but determined not to let fear dictate her actions anymore. Friends and community members offered support, bringing meals, words of encouragement, and sometimes just a quiet presence that reminded her she was not alone. Their faith in her resilience bolstered her own. Finally, the day arrived when the verdict would be read. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. She sat, her hands clasped tightly again, trying to steady her breathing. The judge began to speak, carefully laying out the facts as presented during the trial. He described the events, the testimonies, the evidence, and the law as it applied to her case. She felt her heart rise and fall with every word, hoping for justice, for acknowledgement of the truth, and for recognition of her right to defend herself. When the verdict was finally announced, relief and disbelief washed over her. The charges were dismissed. The court recognized that she had acted in self-defense and that her actions had been justified under the circumstances. Tears filled her eyes, a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and an overwhelming sense of vindication. She had survived not just the night that had threatened her life, but the weeks of fear and uncertainty that followed. The aftermath was complex. There were still conversations to be had, both personally and publicly. She spoke with reporters, emphasizing the importance of understanding, the reality of fear, and the need for accountability in law enforcement. She shared her story not to incite anger or division, but to shed light on the human side of events that are too often reduced to statistics and headlines. Her story resonated with many, sparking discussions about safety, self-defense, and the need for empathy in every encounter between citizens and those sworn to protect them. Slowly, she began to rebuild her life. She returned to her routines, finding solace in the small, ordinary moments she had once taken for granted. She reconnected with friends and family, feeling the warmth of human connection that had been overshadowed by fear. She also became an advocate, speaking out about the importance of understanding one's rights, the value of training and preparedness, and the need for systemic change in policing practices. Despite the trauma she had endured, she found strength in her resilience. She knew that the world had changed for her in ways she could never have anticipated, but she also knew that she had faced her fear, acted with courage, and emerged not just alive, but empowered. The experience had tested her in every way possible, yet it had also revealed the depth of her strength and determination. In quiet moments, she reflected on that night and the weeks that followed. She thought about fear, courage, and the fragile line between life and death. She considered how ordinary people are capable of extraordinary acts when faced with unimaginable situations, and she felt gratitude for the support of those who had stood by her, for the community that had witnessed the truth, and for the chance to continue her life with her integrity intact. Her story became a testament to the human spirit, a reminder that courage often comes in moments when it is least expected, and that standing up for oneself is not an act of aggression, but an assertion of one's right to live. She carried these lessons with her every day, quietly inspiring those around her with her strength, her honesty, and her unwavering commitment to justice. The experience had changed her, but it had not broken her, and she moved forward with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that her life, her courage, and her voice mattered more than ever.